check to prevent dangerous levels of global warming, and they did so by directly investing in the technology, not through making fossil fuels cost more. The problem, of course, in the United States is that while we've increased our federal investment in R&D for the defense, health, and defense and health, we haven't increased it for energy. You can see that energy companies spend 0.23% of their revenues on R&D, in contrast to the pharmaceutical industry, which spends a full 20%. That's 100 times more on their R&D. What time is it? Am I way over? Okay, I'm almost done. Okay, let's talk about forests briefly, because I knew that that probably wasn't overwhelming enough, and you guys need to get more overwhelmed. Do a little bit on forests. This is something that we want to come back to. We see faster deforestation today than at any other point, including in the late 80s when I first became concerned about this as a high school student. We see it being driven by frontier agriculture. This is a soy farm in Brazil. The logging is mostly to clear the forest to make way for big soy plantations, to use the soy to feed the cattle, and the soy and the cattle are used to feed the Chinese and other people that want to eat meat. Deforestation is also, the macro factors are development. Really what's happening in Brazil is what we did in the United States, which was to mostly clear our forests for agriculture. But you also see we're now losing the last great apes, our reminders of where we've come from. We're losing them rapidly as well to poverty and lawlessness and governments that can barely govern themselves. And the conservation that we now have that dominates the international picture is mostly in wealthy countries, and it's absolutely powerless to stop the deforestation that's going on in poor countries. Those governments prioritize feeding their people and becoming wealthy before they prioritize saving nature. Therefore, our argument is that you need to do things with technology that take the pressure off the forests. That means that you need higher yield crops so that they can grow a lot more food on the farms that they have rather than pushing into new farmland. And that means that you need genetically modified organisms, and you need to basically help these states which cannot govern themselves to govern themselves and also to prosper, so that there are alternatives to things like bushmeat. Here is a colleague of ours, a very good environmentalist at Oregon State University, with his evil genetically modified poplar trees. You can tell how evil they are, which have the potential to be fast-growing trees to make it so that we don't have to cut down so many. A very good technological solution, but one that's largely, and I think irrationally, been opposed by folks in my environmental communities. So the big picture is, if we want to have 9 billion people who live basically decent lives, and we want to protect what's remaining of the world's great ancient forests, and we want to protect our primate ancestors, then we need to do this through technology. That means that we need to have clean energy that's a lot cheaper to replace fossil fuels, and that includes next generation nuclear power plants, which are much safer and much cleaner than most people realize. We need GMOs so that we can feed people and take the pressure off of forests. We need to protect more areas while we do all of this. We need continuous improvements to our technologies to reduce the amount of pollution we create. Probably need desalination plants. We're starting to build them in California to pull our rising sea level into cropland. And we're going to end up having a lot more new species. This very controversial salmon, that is a human-invented salmon, the big guy. This is a quote-unquote natural salmon. And that's what humans are going to do. We're going to create new species to replace the ones that we're driving extinct. That's a big fish. Thank you very much. Maybe it wasn't provocative enough. I tried. So now we have some time to chat, right? Okay. You could turn the lights back on if you want. Hi. Yeah.
If you could use the note cards that were on your bench if you have any questions for Michael. And you can either raise your hands and a mic will be brought to you. You can ask your question, or I'll come take your note card if you'd prefer that I read the questions.
Hi, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I have a lot of questions. I'm curious about the biotech risks of monoculture and disease in crops that are genetically modified, and also about the copyright risks where Monsanto, for example, can sue farmers for cross-pollination from the wind, and also cross-pollination. No, I think that's it. Oh, and because a lot of genetically modified crop seeds are designed to only produce once, so the farmers are forced to buy seeds every year instead of being able to save seeds.
Great. Thanks. So, yeah, it's always an interesting, I think the GMOs is one of the most controversial things that we talk about now. So I think the first thing to say about it is that there are going to be risks with GMOs. I mean, there's risks with traditional agriculture. But I think one of the things that's going forward is that we've been eating GMO foods for now over a decade, and you haven't had the adverse health effects that, in fact, haven't had any adverse health effects that people have talked about. The worst adverse health effect, of course, is obesity, which is not related to the GMO foods, but it's from a whole set of lifestyle changes. I think that GMOs are a public good, and I don't think that companies like Monsanto should be in charge of them. And I think that the way that we avoid that is by treating them like a public good and not saying, well, Monsanto's got this GMO and so be it. I think we need to make more significant investments in agricultural research to have new GMOs so that you don't have a single company monopolizing them. And you can accelerate the pace of innovation. I think one of the original promise of GMOs, and people don't realize that Rachel Carson talked about the promise of GMOs in Silent Spring. And the original, one of the promises was you would use less chemicals. And I think with Roundup Ready soy, you haven't had that promise fully realized. But I think the idea is that's the direction you want to go in. So I think I'm largely with you on your concerns around too much corporate control. And I feel the same way about energy as well. I think that these are things that the public has a strong interest in accelerating the pace of innovation to achieve things that are in the public good, public benefit, including healthier crops, including more stable crops, less chemicals, and I think fewer monopolies. Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about genetically modified organisms, which is really a terrible word because, of course, most of the plants we eat were genetically modified, have been genetically modified. They were modified, though, through cruder methods, like blasting seeds with radiation to get mutations, cross-pollination, and what GMOs refers to is actually doing that process more precisely in a laboratory.
Thanks. This question is a double question about nuclear power and GMOs, and you've addressed the GMO portion of it, I believe. How do you propose changing the views folks here against nuclear power that are now active in the environmental movement Do their views need to change, and why? Basically, expand on your nuclear power.
Well, I'll first say I don't know if I can change your views on nuclear power. I mean, people that I think if you spend many decades being against something like nuclear power, there's probably nothing I can say that would assuage your fears. But what I would say is that the way that I changed, I grew up anti-nuclear. I went to anti-nuclear rallies as a boy. When we went to the local nuclear power plant as a high school student, I was sort of leading the charge of ridicule and contempt on the nuclear power plant's managers. What I would say is that you have to evaluate risk. I am much more concerned about the risks of global warming than I am about the risks of nuclear waste or about the risks of a nuclear meltdown. The worst nuclear accident we had pales in comparison to the disasters that we have every year from fossil fuels. In Chernobyl, several hundred people died. It was a tragedy. And you had that from a reactor that had no containment dome, which is at the height of absurdity in a closed society, the Soviet in Soviet Ukraine, where many of the deaths were due to people drinking radioactive milk after the accident. Interestingly enough, there had been a similar accident, not as bad, but a similar accident in Britain where the milk was contaminated, but in that open society, all that milk was thrown away and there were no deaths from it. Meanwhile, there are 2 million air pollution deaths a year. 1 million of those deaths is attributable to coal. That's 1,000 times more deaths than from Chernobyl. And you have 2,000 coal miner deaths a year. With fossil fuels, we end up despoiling some of our great ecosystems like we've just done in the Gulf. So, I mean, the interesting thing is that when you actually talk to energy scientists, they love nuclear power. They see it as this incredible improvement over fossil fuels. And I think that we all thought for a long time, well, no, we have better alternatives like solar and wind. But the problem with those technologies is that they're very difficult to scale and they're very expensive. Natural gas is about twice as expensive right now as wind. And getting a wind farm built is incredibly difficult. We spent about 10 years trying to get Cape Wind built off the coast of Cape Cod against vicious NIMBY opposition. And you find that NIMBY opposition everywhere you want to build a wind farm, and you find it from the same people who are most concerned about global warming. You find it against solar thermal plants in the desert. So what you get from nuclear is the possibility of very cheap base load power that I think quite clearly, if you look at the facts, is a much safer alternative than today's fossil fuels and has the potential to be much safer. I mean, some of the new designs in particular use things like gravity to have automatic shutoff. And when I look at the waste problem, I'm comparing a small amount of nuclear waste to a huge amount of carbon waste in the atmosphere that could create very serious catastrophic consequences. So I look at the risk calculus, and I think there's really no question.
This question is about technology. Isn't it dangerous to say that all technology is sacred, especially when many technologies make us more dependent upon finite energy sources to live, particularly agricultural technologies like Bordeaux's hybridization? And using, implied here is it takes a lot of energy to produce the food.
Yeah, just to clarify,